www.deepeningseggregation.org.
Dan? Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Keith Sellers. Good morning. If you're ready, we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. I'm thrilled. Hello, Ron Kaplan. I'm thrilled to welcome you to Union Market. So thank you for being here. I'm Jody McLean. I'm CEO of Edens, and it's a pleasure to host today the Union Market Talks on being a catalyst for inclusive prosperity. I'm not sure we expected to fill every chair, so we're thrilled you're here. I take it that is your passion for Richard, Florida. Maybe it's reflective of your passion for our city, or maybe it's just that we all enjoy being in spaces and coming together in places like Union Market. We have a great program planned this morning, including the first public conversation with my good friend and urbanist Richard Florida about his just released book, The New Urban Crisis. And I think somebody asked me earlier how I knew Richard. And I'll tell you all, I knew Richard by reputation. I had read the creative class. But when we went to go open the market here, and we're really thinking about what success looked like at Union Market 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, we knew enough to know that by ourselves as developers, we didn't know the answer. And so we invited Richard and we invited a few other very strong urbanists to come in and sit with us for a day and just help us charrette, not the physical plant, not the architecture, but really charrette what the meaning of a great urban district meant. And that was the beginning of what I hope to be a lifelong and a great relationship. And I'm really pleased to be here today with this new book. I'd also like to thank the many other experts who are going to be with us today and leaders, our own Mayor Muriel Bowser, Mayor Tom Murphy, Ron Brownstein, Rob Boyle, and Ed Glickman. I also want to thank our partners in today's event, City Lab, EIG, and ULI. And finally, thank and acknowledge our partners, Peregrine Espresso and Politics and Prose, whose presence will allow each of you to get a signed book after the event. Clearly, cities are essential drivers of economic development, innovation, and creativity. In the last 2 decades, the return of residents back to the city centers has transformed our nation's urban economies. DC is a great example of a thriving, diverse city. We have sustained consistent growth for the last 10 years, if not longer, and have maintained an ethnic diversity as well as a socioeconomic diversity while expanding our employment base by just under 12% and adding close to 80,000 new jobs over the 10 years. But as we've added these new jobs, our household income, our median household income, has also risen by about 60%. During the same time, though, our median housing expense has risen, and renting expenses has risen 70.3%, and our owner-occupied 41%. These are stats that we all have to pay attention to, and they give me a little bit of pause. They're very typical. Edens operates throughout all major cities. We have 125 projects throughout the United States, and we're seeing very typical stats in every urban market in which we're active. The thought that we continuously come back to as a group is, can we continue to maintain the balance of growth and prosperity while maintaining a diverse population living in close proximity to the amenities of their lives? At Edens, we're really focused on the first 20 feet. We like to say that's where our energy goes, that's where our creativity goes, because in those first 20 feet, we can continuously bring back diverse groups like-minded people in continuous conversation and engagement with one another, incredible outcomes happen. Incredible opportunities emerge in our much broader community, and we believe we're inspiring great things to happen above us, in the office, in the residential. So my hope is it's not a coincidence, but rather intentional, that Richard's engaging in his first public conversation regarding the new urban crisis from Union Market, a place that in its little short life has created approximately 500 new jobs in Ward 5, not including any of our temporary construction jobs. And among that, Union Market is bringing diverse housing solutions and is giving our office and retail partners a chance to innovate, experiment, as well as grow and scale their businesses. But most importantly, Union Market is intentionally and continuously fostering these conversations around the table between really diverse cohorts in order to inspire openness of thought and attitude about risk-taking. In order to continue to push innovation, I believe the following ingredients are a must. A place where there's routine engagement of diversity and openness of thought to push for these new ideas and risk on execution. Entrepreneurs have to have access to capital to grow and access to accessible, trained, and prepared workforce. With the demands on people's lives, they need to be able to live relatively close to the amenities of their lives, which include their work, their friends, their retail, their churches. And in order for any community to reach its highest potential, members must have constant inspiration and hope. But as we all know, and I'm sure Richard will discuss, these same forces that drive success can ultimately generate divides that hold us back if we're not intentional on decision-making that leads to long-term prosperity for all. Our cities need broader strategies for building greater inclusive prosperity in our communities. Cities will remain the most powerful economic engine the world has ever seen, but the only way forward is to evolve the model of urbanism and urbanism for all. All community stakeholders, our residents, businesses, private sectors, municipalities, civic organizations, play a critical role in helping achieve this much-needed goal. We believe working together, we can continue to progress our cities and neighborhoods to ensure a more inclusive prosperity in which all residents can participate. This is a long-term solution that ensures a viable, diverse, healthy community, healthy economy, and healthy lifestyle where we will see all of our fellow residents succeed and flourish. Now it is with great pleasure for me to introduce to you Ron Brownstein, the editorial director for the National Journal Group. Ron is a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist for political reporting and has been named one of America's best political journalists by The Economist. Ron, if you'll bring Richard, Professor, Florida. Thank you.
Thanks, Jody. It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague at The Atlantic, Richard Florida. He is joining us today, come on up, Richard, for a conversation about his new book, The New Urban Crisis. And Richard, one thing I've learned in selling books is always have a book, so you can hold up the book.
Thank you for bringing it.
I wanted to make sure I at least had one. He is, of course, one of the world's leading urbanists, researcher and professor, serving as director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, a distinguished fellow at New York University, a writer and journalist, author of several bestsellers, including the seminal The Rise of the Creative Class, a senior editor at The Atlantic, and a editor-at-large and co-founder of our City Lab publication. Time Magazine recounted your Twitter feed as one of the 140 most influential in the world. I guess they had a 140-character limit on the listing.
And there were only 140 of us tweeting at that time.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Let's kind of, we mentioned the creative class, and that's certainly a work for which I'm guessing almost everyone in this room has read. One of the most influential books about cities in recent decades. And in The Rise of the Creative Class, you argue that luring talented members of the creative class was a key to reviving cities. And in many ways, that's exactly what's happened to a remarkable extent over the past 2 decades. And you can see the effect in places like this that is spread. I was in Chicago this weekend, and you see the movement there as well. It sure looks like a lot is going well for cities. But after that revival, after that theory largely played out the way that you expected in one sense, you now see a new urban crisis. So what defines the new urban crisis, and what went wrong?
Thank you, Ron. Well, I was living in Pittsburgh at the time, and it's so nice that we'll be joined by our mayor of Pittsburgh, Tom Murphy, in just a little while, kind of bookending this. And I love Pittsburgh. I loved Pittsburgh. I lived there for as much time as I grew up in my boyhood home in New Jersey. I lived there for 17 years, and I taught at one of the greatest universities in the world, Carnegie Mellon University. And I was very involved with Mayor Murphy and others in the revival of Pittsburgh. What an incredible thing it was to see how many other communities had really seen the floor cut out from under them. But Pittsburgh, thanks to great leadership, great philanthropy, great universities, great neighborhood, was able to stave off the worst of decline. Carnegie Mellon, where I was teaching, had a per person or per research and development dollar level of productivity in terms of invention, patenting, spin-off company, like MIT or Stanford. Yet, at that time, now things have changed wonderfully, but at that time, the young people who were making those inventions were leaving the city to go to the Silicon Valley or Boston. My students, I went back to class one day and I said, how many of you young people want to stay in Pittsburgh? And not a hand went up. So that's where many of my ideas come from my local circumstance. I'm an urbanist. So why wasn't Pittsburgh? So the idea was then the 3 T's, technology, talent, and tolerance. We had the technology in the great universities and the great companies. We had the talent, but for some reason, I can go on and on about this, it was a long time ago, it wasn't gluing itself to Pittsburgh. So the creative class was a group that I identified, really highly educated people who work in knowledge-based industries, scientists, entrepreneurs, researchers, innovators, artists, musicians. They were selecting places based on not only the economic opportunity, of course I talked about that, but where they wanted to be, where other similar-minded people were, which were open-minded, they were diverse, they were boys, they were girls, they were black, they were white, they were Hispanic, they were Latino, Asian, they were gay, they were straight. They wanted to be in a place that was exciting, and then the investment followed. Well, I went to see a former mayor of this city recently with our colleague Rob Ball, who's now running the city lab and doing a spectacular job. And he said to me, he pointed to my books, and he said, Florida, we followed your playbook, and Lord, did you screw us up. And I said, oh, Mr. Mayor, you're gonna like my next book, The New Urban Crisis. After a lot of introspection, but in particular moving to Toronto, a city that is a boom town like Washington, D.C., where there are more cranes in the sky than any other city in North America, where there are people moving in from all over that country and all over the world, I saw what I argued was not only the most dysfunctional and crack-addicted mayor in modern memory, but the most anti-urban mayor be elected in my town. Here's the naive American going to Toronto, the progressive social nirvana. And I had to grapple with these divides, which you've written more eloquently about than anyone. These divides which were coming from really the mechanism of urban clustering. And that's what the central thesis of the book is. The same force of urban clustering that creates concentrations of technology investment, concentrations of startup companies in the Bay Area, now in San Francisco, in Lower Manhattan, now in DC. The same force that forces talented and creative people. This is the force my mentor and idol Jane Jacobs identified as the motor force of urban development and economic development. It also divides us. You see it here in Washington, D.C., because as the affluent people, as the talented people, as the companies come back to the city, there's only a limited amount of land. And we have this very vigorous competition for urban space. So, as best I can tell, the top 10% of income earners are the ones moving back to the city, and they're forcing the less fortunate out.
You describe the clustering as a Janus-faced force. On the one hand, you say it is driving rapid growth. On the other, you write it is carving deep divides into our cities and our society. Explain why it is simultaneously having two such powerful and disparate effects?
You know, and I think, to be honest, I and others minimized the contradictory effect. I think naively, I'd be very honest, and I think even Jane Jacobs would have said, you know, 20 years ago, my God, we have to encourage this clustering. We want to see our cities come back. You know, I grew up, I talk in the book, I was a creature of the old urban crisis, born in 1957 in Newark. I saw the city blow up. You know, I opened the book with my dad saying to me, lay down on the floor, son, they're shooting. You know, National Guardsmen tanks. So I was very forged by this crisis of my city, then Newark, seeing abandonment and decay. So what happened, of course, is due to this clustering, which Jane identified many, many years ago, and Robert Lucas once said she deserved a Nobel Prize for this, even though she didn't go to graduate school and was not an economist. She identified this fundamental force of clustering which drives urbanism and drives economic growth. When talented people, like all of us, come to a community, we cluster together, we mix and we mingle, we rub shoulders with each other, we then innovate, we create companies, we create art, we create music, we create all the great things in cities throughout civilization. But of course, now, in the knowledge economy, the world isn't flat. The world's spiky. We are clustering and clustering and clustering in a smaller set of, I call them the superstar cities, the New Yorks, the Londons, the Parises, the knowledge hubs, the San Franciscos, the DCs, the Bostons, the Austins, the Boulders, I can go on. So we're competing. You know, San Francisco had a fifth of all venture capital investment in 1990. It now has nearly half. The only place that has really measurably increased its rate of startup outside of the Bay Area is New York City. In London, but I'm talking about the US. And two neighborhoods in San Francisco, it's my favorite statistic in the book, right downtown, have more than $1 billion in startups every year, which is more than any other country on earth, save for the United States. So we are cramming ourselves into this limited amount of space. And at the same time, as the affluent, as the advantaged, as the creative class, I could go on, the techies, the global super rich, absentee investors, invest in these cities, they push others out. So we see, of course, part of the new urban crisis is the migration of the urban crisis into the suburbs. So it carves these divides that I saw with the election of Rob Ford. And I say in the book, if Rob Ford could happen in Toronto, and this is, I wrote this book before Trump, by the way, I had to revise it completely after the election. But I say if Rob Ford could happen in as progressive, a cosmopolitan, a socially oriented city as Toronto, watch out. More and worse will follow.
Let me come back to the Trump in a minute. We do a lot of events in the Atlantic with mayors around. I've done events with mayors in, I'd say, a dozen cities over the last 2 years. And with all of them, you hear some version of the same problem. John Hickenlooper, when he was the mayor of Denver, called it the Denver paradox, which is they are creating jobs again, which is good. They are attracting talent from all over the country and all over the world, in many cases. But they can't equip their own kids from the lower income neighborhoods in their city to compete for the jobs they are creating. From the south side of Chicago to the north side of Chicago, you know, you might as well be trying to walk to the moon. And so when you kind of look at all of those cities that describe this same challenge, and certainly, you know, here in DC, a prime example of this challenge, what are the answers to ultimately have a broader circle of a community benefit from the undeniable growth that is occurring again?
Well, and that really is the theme of the new urban crisis. How do we find a way out of this? So first, what you've defined in my terms, in spatial terms, I could define it in class terms, but others have done that, including myself in Rise of the Creative Class. In spatial terms or geographic terms, what we have is no longer a city and suburban divide. Now that divide very much exists. But as affluence has moved to the city and poverty has moved to the suburbs, we really have a new, I call it a patchwork city, a patchwork metropolis, a divided city, a divided metropolis, where we have areas of concentrated advantage. In DC, it's sort of half. We're cut in half. But in California, where you live, in Los Angeles, it's strung out against the coastline and a little bit downtown. In New York, it's obviously in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and then it goes out into the suburbs. We could go on and on. The maps are in the book. But we have these small spans of concentrated affluence and advantage, surrounded by much larger spans of concentrated affluence. The big thing is the middle has fallen out. We've become a hollowed out society, not only in terms of our class structure, but in terms of our geographic structure. One of the big points of the book is that the middle class neighborhoods, they are the platforms for upward mobility. I was born in one in Newark. My parents then put us boys in North Arlington, another working blue-collar, middle-class neighborhood. I got a scholarship to Rutgers, and then my life changed. Many of my friends fell victim to all the problems, urban problems of violence, crime, drug abuse. So they were our platforms for upward mobility and our platforms for the American dream. My dad buying that little small house. More than 2/3 of us lived in middle-class neighborhoods in the year 1970. Now, according to the most recent data, less than 40% of us do. I'm afraid when the new data comes out, it's going to be more like 1/3. I forget the Pew statistic exactly, but roughly in 209 of 233 metros, they tracked the middle class's decline. The middle class decline has been the biggest in the most vibrant technology, knowledge-based, the New Yorks, the San Franciscos, the Bostons, the DCs. So that's the problem. We lack these middle class drivers. And in the book, I talk about what we can do. And it's going to be mayors and governors, like the mayor here, like Mayor Hickenlooper, but just very quickly, we're going to have to build more. I'm going to come back to that. We're going to have to build more affordable housing in the urban center. We're going to have to invest in transit, and we're going to have to upgrade those service jobs. We're going to have to, there are now, in DC, about almost half the workforce works in service jobs, in food prep, restaurant work, office work, retail work, personal service work. Those folks have like 20 grand left over after paying for housing, and members of the creative class have like 80 grand. We don't have a middle class, and the only way we're going to have a middle class is to make those jobs better jobs, to pay those people better, and the book talks a lot about how we get there. So we're going to have to rebuild the middle class.
Now, you know, in the book, in the first chapter, first page, you start, imagine that you could travel back in time to 1975, snatch a random New Yorker off the street and set him loose in the city today. I volunteer. I was a random New Yorker. I was a high school senior in 1975 in New York.
We're the same age.
We're the same age. And that was the era of Ford to New York, drop dead. I remember taking the subway with newspapers blowing through the cars, you know, and graffiti everywhere. The concern then in I guess the original urban crisis was that cities would be a kind of sinkhole of dysfunction and despair that would kind of pull down everything around them. But now the concern seems to be the opposite, that they're kind of having this escape velocity and that they are thriving while the Trumpian countryside is withering away. Are we worried that cities are doing too well and concentrating too much of the opportunity in the society at this point?
Well, it's funny, you know, we are the same age. I graduated high school in that exact same year and went off to Rutgers. And I had this amazing professor named Robert Lake, and I could tell stories all day long. My parents wanted me to be a doctor, and then they had a whole Italian family reunion. When I said, no, I don't want to be a doctor and do pre-med, they said, be a dentist. I'm like, I don't want to be a dentist. Mm-hmm. And you know, I said, you know what, I'll be a lawyer. My mother said, you'll be good at that, you're a good talker, Richard. So, but I remember this professor said, this is where the example comes from, your assignment in urban geography is to take the train from New Brunswick, where I was at Rutgers College, take the subway, and go tour Lower Manhattan. And I saw, you know, Soho with the artists encroaching on the old manufacturing buildings. I saw what was happening in Greenwich Village. You know, my mental model of a city was Newark. So I saw these first tender shoots of an urban revival. And I think I was very excited about that. I think in my work on the rise of the creative class in Pittsburgh, I was very excited about that. So what's happened, though, is this red-blue divide that you have written more eloquently than anyone, that we've chronicled, we've actually written together on this, about the number of counties that are blue and how they become blue, or the numbers that are red. This urban revival have packed the talented, the successful, the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the artists and the musicians in a handful of places, creating a thriving, you know, urban cores, creating thriving metropolitan areas, and pushing people out to the suburbs, here, the exurbs, or pushing them to other areas. So you have these little dots of economic vibrancy, economic dynamism that are blue, and then, you know, much larger spans that are falling behind. And I think that's what's behind this populist backlash. People are saying, you know, I am being left behind. I don't know why. Not just me. My place is being left behind. I don't know why. And I'm mad. And I, you know, I saw it in Toronto. I know this is Washington, D.C., America's capital. But if I could see that backlash in Toronto, and by the way, not just coming from the white working class, coming from what Canadians call new Canadians, Caribbean, Indian, Asian people saying, no, we're being locked out, and our children are being locked out of this urban revival. I think that is the underlying economic, social, cultural, and political dynamic and that's why I think it's bigger than a new urban crisis. Yeah. It's actually the central crisis of capitalism and democracy.
The statistic that really jumps out that we talked about before is that Hillary Clinton won fewer than 1/6 of all the counties in the country, and yet her counties account for 2/3 of all the economic activity in the country. Is that a sustainable model for the society more broadly?
No.
No.
And that's why I had to rewrite the book in the wake of the election. You know, we woke up, we had a party in Toronto, and, well, it wasn't much of a party. And we woke up in the morning, and, you know, my wife, who I've barely seen cry, was in tears. And I learned something that day about the difference between women and men, but that's for another conversation. Because I took it seriously, but I've never seen so many of my women friends crushed like this. So my wife said something very brilliant. She said, you know, Richard, we're pretty advantaged. We do pretty well. Imagine if Mrs. Clinton had won, how the other side would feel. And that's when I undertook, and I called my publisher and said, I have to rewrite the book. And I said, you know, I had been calling for federal solutions. I consider myself a progressive. It's not what this is about. But I've been calling for Mrs. Clinton, you know, imagining. She would be elected, and we would have a council of cities, like the National Economic Council or the National Security Council, staffed by mayors like Mayor Murphy or Fort Mayor Hickenlooper. We could go on. The blurbers of the book, you know. We would have this council of urbanists and cities, and we would have a national agenda for affordable housing and transit. And then I said, oh my God, this will never happen. But I think it caused me, and you know, if Joel Kotkin, my once nemesis, and I have an op-ed in the Daily Beast today,
wow,
a joint op-ed calling that says to empower, to overcome our divides, empower cities. And here's what I've come to believe. The only way out of the red-blue divide is to reduce the stakes. It's not just about economic vibrancy and about building better cities and how mayors know better, that, and how cities are, I know all of that, that's been written about. But the only way to recover our divide, you're going to know, and that's why I'd like to actually us put our minds together on this, Ron. The nation state and the imperial presidency were really great for their day, 100 or half century, 100 years ago, half century ago. We needed Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We needed a strong president. We needed all of this. We needed Social Security. But now it's outlived its shelf life. And every 8 years we have the equivalent of a national political civil war. The only way for us to heal, I think, is for us to say, look, if I want to live in a blue city or a blue suburb, I can govern myself and empower my mayor. And I can. If you want to live in a red, if you want to live in a red city or suburb, that's okay. But we still have faith in our localities. We still have faith in our communities. So it seems to me we have to empower communities to make the investments and address the challenges they need. We have to devolve power from Washington, put resources back in the hands of mayor, and politically, I think that reduces the stakes. It won't be that every 8 years we have this national trauma because the federal government won't be so strong. So that's what, when we talk about inclusive prosperity, that's what we mean. And hopefully in the wake of this book, you know, now the book's out there and it's causing conversations. Not everyone's going to like it, and I'm going to be a lightning rod, which is great. I like that. But I think this conversation, the bigger conversation than me, is how to empower the communities to overcome the divide and to build and address the challenges.
You know, there are a lot of policy things and recommendations in the book I could ask you about, but in the time we have left, I want to ask you about one other thing. The process that led you to writing this book seemed to me unusually personal and even emotional. You wrote,
yes,
quote, I entered into a period of rethinking and introspection, of personal and intellectual transformation, of which this book is the result. That sounds like more than the usual academic reconsideration. What struck you so hard about the set of conclusions you reached here and how they differed from some of your earlier thinking in the 90s?
Well, the big thing was obviously the way the world changed economically and this concentration and clustering and how much the back to the city movement of the creative class outpaced what I could have imagined. And remember, this thing really happens after 2000. After Rise was written, the urban back to the city movement takes off. The divide that you and I have written about together, that you have written about more eloquently than me, that this divide in our country, the rise of Rob Ford, as impactful on me as Newark, as impactful on me as Pittsburgh, the rise, you know, to see this dysfunctional, crack-addicted, anti-urban mayor. But my critics, I'm an open-minded person. I care about ideas and I care deeply about cities. A smart critic like Joel Kotkin, not the silly ones, a smart critic like Joel Kotkin, who when I was pissed off as hell at him, I had to say, you know, Joel had a point. I might not agree with it. I might still not agree with it, but we've become close friends because I said to him, Joel, I respect you, and I respect what you say. I don't always agree. We have a different take, but we need both. But even more so, Ron, you know, I fashioned myself a progressive urban to be seen as the neoliberal devil, foisting gentrification on cities, is not a situation I like to be seen in. I see myself as a good Obama voter, a good Hillary. I could go on and on. You know, a person who's a very, if you take a tail of the distribution, I'm on the left end. And to see, holy shit, sorry, excuse me. That's not what I meant. I meant cities should come back and we should invest in cities. So really for me, it was a criticism by people on the left. And me saying, you know, they have a point and I want to respond to it and I want to respond to it. And then finally, because of The Atlantic, because of David Bradley, who owns The Atlantic, because we have a platform now that he invested in at City Lab, we have people like Rob, I actually had an ability to convene a conversation, right? I didn't have that before. So if I could be open and honest and transparent about both my strengths and my shortcomings, about how critics, hopefully, I think this field, folks, of urbanism is the greatest field in the world. I think it's greater than economics, I think it's greater than sociology, and we suffer from the narcissism of small differences on steroids. But there's a big world out there, and I wanted to try to showcase this field when it agrees with me, when it doesn't, in all of its kind of beauty and intelligence. So that's what did it.
Our clock is ticking, but let me ask you real quick. Are there any cities or mayors who you think have found a way to balance the dynamic growth that you're talking about while also creating ladders of opportunity or bridges for all communities in their city to benefit from it? Is there any place that's no one has really gotten it right yet?
Because the crisis is just emergent, and a mayor like Eric Garcetti is dealing with minimum wage and better jobs. A mayor like Bill de Blasio is dealing with affordable housing. We could go on and on. A mayor like Sadiq Khan and Anne Hidalgo in London and Paris. But here's what I want to say. You mentioned John Hickenlooper.
Right.
1 minute. Here's my dream. In the next election cycle, the Democrats nominate a mayor. Let's pick one. Let's pick, you mentioned him, John Hickenlooper. And that mayor says, we're going to make America great by giving power back to you and the communities. And to prove that, I'm going to pick a Republican. I just learned he's a friend. I just learned he was a Republican because I'm going to take Mick Cornett, the mayor of Oklahoma City, as my running mate. We're going to run as a bipartisan ticket to tear down the dysfunction of Washington, to port power back to communities, to give power back to you. If you're red, if you're blue, you can invest, you can live the way you want to live, and we won't bother it. I think that's a winning scenario, and I think that's the kind of, if we don't have that ticket, that's the kind of debate we need to be having in this country.
The good news is,
You're very kind. Thank you.
The good news about no one having figured it out yet is that there's still plenty to talk about for the rest of the day. So we're going to leave the stage out. Join me in thanking Richard Florida and turn you over to the next panel.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think the next panel is up to me. We have a fantastic day planned for you guys, and I am just so thrilled that Ron could be part of this. You know, they asked, who would you like to have a conversation with you, and the first person I said was Ron Brownstein, my colleague at The Atlantic, who to my mind is the greatest political and social and cultural journalist of our time. And we have a great afternoon with people who are amazing on these issues. And I get the honor of, what? Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. So I think I know why we're going to switch the order of our panels, but we are going to. So I will leave the stage and Rob, invite my colleague Rob Bohl to talk, and we're going to switch the order of the panels. Rob is the general manager and director of City Lab. He has brought, we've become dear friends, he has brought such energy to something I love, and what he has done to build it, and what he is going to do, we are going to do to build it, to take it to the next level is just exceptional. And Rob's going to conduct the panel, Jody, and Steve, to talk about what's happening at the local and the national level in terms of addressing these economic disparities and development. Thank you, guys. I think I figured out what's happening.
So first of all, this is Washington, D.C., not New York City, so I'm not entirely sure why the mayor is not here exactly at the time they're supposed to be. But it's her city, so we'll let her be late. So this panel is about the notion of what we can do to drive prosperity and inclusive growth. People on my right are folks that are intimately involved in actually doing something about that as a part of their work, but also have understanding and thoughts about what we should be doing as a country. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about this. So I'm joined by two wonderful panelists. Jody McLean is the Chief Executive Officer of Edens. We're sitting in one of her wonderful developments today. And Steve Glickman is the co-founder and executive director of the Economic Innovation Group, a nonprofit whose mission is to enhance solutions that empower engagement and incentivize building a more dynamic U.S. economy. And I realize that I have my glasses on because I can't see far away, not quite closely. So Jody has been described as one of the most influential women in commercial real estate. As Eden's CEO, she helped grow the company to more than $6 billion of assets. She's responsible for Eden's strategy to move the company's portfolio to major urban centers, and a strategy to move to major urban centers, transforming neighborhoods and communities for the better. A great example of this, as I just said, is Union Market, where I come pretty frequently with my family and can tell that it is an actual vibrant community. Sometimes on a Sunday morning, maybe too vibrant in terms of sitting down. But she's the trustee of the International Council of Shopping Centers and the Urban Land Institute, where she also sits as the newly created Executive Committee for the Americas. And to her right is Executive Director of EIG, Economic Innovation Group, Steve Glickman, responsible for the strategic direction of that group and the impact of the organization. He previously served as a senior economic advisor at the White House under President Barack Obama, special advisor to the U.S. Department of Commerce, and counsel to the former Congressman Henry Waxman. His work has been featured in various publications, The Atlantic, The New York Times, NPR, and The Washington Post. And also, I would direct you to his website because they do some really groundbreaking and interesting studies that should be on the reading lists of everyone in this room. So we're going to start, Steve, with you. As we discuss building greater inclusion and opportunity in our communities, how do you define inclusion? And can you talk about the role of the dynamic economy that promotes and drives and contributes to inclusion?
So thanks, Robert, and thanks, Richard and Jody. It's fantastic to be here. I'm going to take blame for moving the panel up. My wife is due with our first baby in 2 days. So she said, if you could move your panel up, just in case, that would be great. And so now I can come home with a win. So thank you. Thank you, Mayor Bowser, for that. So I think I'll probably take a slightly different track in defining inclusion than Richard did. But it's along a very similar theme. And that's that the very notion of what it takes to be able to live the American dream in this country is crumbling. And it's crumbling in a way we've really never seen before. A big chunk of that is geographic. And the geographic divide in this country is the single most important national crisis that you don't hear anyone talking about. Here's why. Right now, if you're living in most cities across the country, and Raj Chetty, who's a fantastic thinker on this at both Stanford and Harvard, has written about this quite a bit. If you're poor in a number of cities across the country, your chance of moving from the bottom 20% to the top 20% is basically zero. There's no shot for you. If you live in San Francisco, Seattle, if you live in LA, New York, you've got a chance. If you live in Atlanta, Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, no chance. What does that mean? It means that not only won't you move to the top 20%, but if you're poor in those communities, it means you're going to die earlier. The life expectancy of someone who's poor in an economically distressed city is 7 years less than someone who's poor in a wealthier city. It means everything's different. Your access to jobs, your access to healthcare, your access to opportunity. So access to opportunity, to me, is the key of what it creates to be inclusive. And we're focused on the wrong way of getting there in both our politics and I would argue in our economics. We're very focused on what is destroying too much in this country. We're very focused on globalization. Foreign companies are taking our jobs. Or technology. The next big thing is making it so an American worker doesn't have to work anymore. Actually, the rate at which things are destroyed in this economy, that companies are closing, is lower than it's ever been. What we're not doing in this country is we're not creating enough. The rate of new business creation in this country is at a 40-year low. We produce a slower rate of new business creation than we have since we've started collecting those statistics. And what does that mean? Really simply, the problem we're all trying to solve for is how people get good jobs again. That's what leads to all of the political anxiety we're seeing in our system. In a big chunk of the country, good jobs don't exist anymore. And the reason, a big part of the reason those new jobs don't exist is because we're not creating the new industries to replace the industries that we've lost in a very concentrated part of the country. If you're sitting in a big Midwestern city or you're sitting in a rural part of the South, you're living in one of the worst economic circumstances you've lived in a generation. Which means for the first time in US history, people think that their kids are going to be worse off economically than they are, and the reason they think it is because it's true.
So when you talk about the geographical barriers to some of this economic development, and we're going to talk a little bit later about the Investment to Opportunity Act, but how are some of the ways in which the federal government as well as state as well as local governments should be looking at addressing those barriers, and what's the role of the private sector in that?
So I think your question is totally right on the mark in identifying where these solutions have to come from. Let's start with a very core notion. They have to come from the federal government, the local government, and the private sector. All of the parts of that have to be a part of the equation. The federal government's probably the weakest part of that link from the perspective of what they can actually do. They have really one very powerful vehicle, and that's the tax code. The tax code is an incredible mechanism for incentivizing behavior you want and punishing behavior you don't want. But we have a huge problem in our national politics. Both parties are having the same economic debate they had 30 years ago. Even though, to Richard's point, starting in 2000, but even more importantly, starting after the recession, the nature of the economy totally changed. Both parties running up to, let's say, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, agreed on one simple notion. If you had enough growth in this country, and the US is growing faster than any other westernized economy right now, that all boats would rise with that tide. That is broken. Growth in this country is entirely limited to those super performing cities that Richard talks about. You're sitting in one right now in DC. And the other cities aren't benefiting from that same type of growth because they haven't done the sort of things that they need to do to compete. They haven't diversified their economy. They haven't upskilled their workers. They're no longer able to attract the investment that they need. And the result of that is it's not that if you look at the cities doing really well, it's the cities that are the most connected to a globalized economy and are most connected to technology, have the best broadband infrastructure. They're the ones that are connected to this changing economy. The ones that are most isolated from it are failing. The federal government has a very important way they can, I think, help that process through the tax code, but I think we'll get at that later. The local government. Local leadership here matters a lot. Cities that have bad local leadership got crushed. Good examples. Detroit, not the current mayor of Detroit, Mayor Duggan, who's doing a great job. The former mayor of Detroit, the former mayor of New Orleans, now criminals, in jail because they basically bankrupted those cities. They crushed those cities, which are now amazing entrepreneurial hubs. There's nothing inherent about Detroit or New Orleans that means it can't have a robust entrepreneurial ecosystem. It had terrible local leadership. We have other great examples. DC's been blessed by a series of really strong mayors. Everyone from Tony Williams through Adrian Fenty through Muriel Bowser have developed the cities in ways that have changed the dynamic of what it is to live in DC. There are other cities too, and these are red state cities in red states that are doing great. Mayor Pete Buttigieg in South Bend, Indiana, turned a really failed manufacturing economy into something that's now really robust and exciting. Mayor Greg Fisher in Louisville, Kentucky. Mayor Andrew Gillum in Tallahassee, Florida. These are not places you think about as economic and entrepreneurial powerhouses, but there's something those mayors are doing that's changing the game. And the third, and I'd argue the most important piece, is the private sector. The private sector, particularly two pools of the private sector, the investor class and big companies, are making more money than they've ever made before in the modern history of the US. Stock market, record highs. The investor class is doing great. Corporate profits also at record highs. There's a downside to that, immense corporate concentration, making it much more difficult for entrepreneurs to compete. But we're also focused on the wrong type of things in cities. Typically, the way we've stimulated economic development in cities is by offering some kind of tax giveaway for a big company to come in and deposit a bunch of jobs. Study after study after study shows that that does not work. What we should be doing is bottom-up creation. We need to do three basic things. One, stimulate an entrepreneurial ecosystem. You need people to create the new businesses and industries of the future. That's where good jobs come from. Two, you need investment, particularly private investment. Without private investment, cities aren't successful. This is a great example of where private investment is making a huge impact. And three, you need skills training. We have a huge apparatus of vocational schools and community colleges that are basically entirely misused. Bring in the companies. Make sure the skills you're teaching lead to actual jobs that exist. Create those pathways. It's a big win-win. It's completely broken. So both our capital market, there's plenty of capital, but it's invested in the wrong way. And our labor market, there's plenty of jobs, but we're not skilling people for the jobs that are open, are broken in this country, and the political system so far hasn't woken up to fixing it.
Thank you. So Jody, your company is where the rubber meets the road many times in terms of private investment. A developer, by definition, goes in and makes changes and creates new opportunities. What do you think is the role of private property developers in terms of the developing inclusive prosperity, but also even its obligation to do so?
I would probably start by saying I might be the opposite of everybody else who's been up here. I am squarely in the height of capitalism, being a real estate developer, and quite frankly, very comfortable there. And in that place, I would tell you that there is no obligation, but there is clearly a role for us to play. Success for us, the ultimate success for us, only comes when we're in the most viable economies, we're in the most vital and vibrant places, and that doesn't happen on its own. So maybe it's a forever snowball effect that is adding upon itself, but just like when we came here, we had to be willing to take a long-term approach, and I would say that's probably our biggest challenge. Our biggest challenge is the challenge of opportunity, lost opportunity. So it takes a lot of capital, it takes a lot of private investment to be able to do a place like Union Market and to do it the right way. It takes patience, it takes a long-term vision, it sees well beyond what is today's yield, what is today's return, and really deciding that the place for us where we can be most successful is taking a long-term view, is taking a view that looks out well beyond maybe what's on our immediate pro formas, our immediate development yields, and says what kind of community, what kind of society do we want to be a part of that looks well out and continues to create the greatest value for all. And I think that's a huge issue. So I hope we do get to talk about the Investment Act, because I think the biggest challenge we face every single day is that challenge of opportunity lost, to do things the easy way, to do things where the yields may come a lot quicker. We need partners who help us continuously take that long-term view.
So before we get to the Act, I want to ask you a little bit about Union Market, which is seen as a great success in activating this part of the community and really enhancing and developing new opportunities. How did you, when you were in the process of developing and then programming this market, how did you ensure that your efforts here were going to benefit the community? How do you measure it? How do you talk about it?
We have three measures. We have three measures that we track really every day. Obviously, we have financial measurements, we have operational measurements, and then we have community measurements. And we actually track statistics like crime, statistics like education, we track opportunity, and we track health. We have 125 projects. Our typical market area is defined by a 17-minute travel time. That's typically the time that people will travel to engage in community and to engage in our places. So we have what we call sort of this triple bottom line, and those community stats what we've learned is when we focus there first and foremost, we outperform our financial and our operational goals. So we track that, we hold ourselves accountable, we set goals every year there, just like we would for our financial and our operational goals. And when we came to Union Market, we had to figure out who those right partners are. So I'm going to make a shameless pitch for Thrive. Each and every one of you got this in your chairs. And I think what Taman is doing, what Gary Williams are doing here in this magazine is exceptional. And our role to partner with them is to offer the space, is to offer the support for them to do these things, because what we have found is that when they thrive, and if you haven't had time to look at this, this is really exceptional work, but when we find that when our partners, really close-in neighbors thrive, we all thrive. And these are the kind of communities that we're all attracted to. We're not attracted, even places, I think it was Jane Jacobs who said this, even places where it's all the rich people become very, very boring. We are attracted to places where there is absolute diversity, we feel creative, we feel approachable, and in the long run, these are the places that will be most successful. And when our partners are thriving, it's going to continue to build economic stability, it's going to continue to build opportunity for all of us.
I'm going to ask about, let me ask one more question of you, Jody, before going back and talking to you, Steve. The things that you've done here at Edens in DC, as well as around the country, what are the lessons that you've learned through this process that are replicable in other communities? When you talk to other real estate developers and saying, here are the things that really work that I think could work for you, what do you say to them?
We've learned a lot of lessons. The one thing we've learned is to debrief just about everything we do, and we document lessons learned. Edens is not afraid to make mistakes, and I think as a woman, but also in America, that's unusual. So we've learned to let our places be authentic. We've learned to give control back to communities. We did a project out in Fairfax, a 2 million square foot project. We closed on that land in 2009, things that nobody else was doing. And we held on tight because we were scared to make a mistake in that kind of economic atmosphere. And what we learned was when we trusted the community and we gave back control over the space, it really became much more vibrant, much more vital. It became more successful. So I think we've learned about these partnerships and we've learned how to partner. We've learned that same way within the municipalities in which we're working. We've learned to be authentic. We've learned to push for those things that we truly believe in, but we've learned to listen and to really understand the goals and to trust the goals of the broader communities and to fall within them. And together, I think we've learned that makes the most prosperous outcomes.
Thank you. So, Steve, we've talked a little bit or referenced the Investing in Opportunity Act. Can you spend just a few minutes telling people what it is? I actually must admit I tried to read the act itself, and I utterly failed. So I think I understand what you're trying to do, but the language itself is complicated. So can you tell us a little more about how that is going to incentivize investment into these new opportunity zones, or these zones for inclusion and prosperity? But I also want you to address that there have been zone approaches before. There are people from Housing and Urban Development here, and those zones have had mixed success. How is this going to be different?
So a couple of things. Let me give a quick bit of context. So first, this is a very simple tax bill, actually. It's only 1,500 pages long, which is very easy to read. No, it's only 15 pages long.
I got about 2 pages in.
It's super easy to read through. Robert, I don't know what your problem is, frankly. But I'll talk through it a little bit. Let me give a couple pieces of context and a few quick stats. So here's what we're trying to solve for. There's lots of capital and investable capital in this country. We did a quick look at this. There's about $2.3 trillion in unrealized capital gains just in stocks and mutual funds. That's more than the amount of money we talk about when we're talking about corporate repatriated profits from overseas that we're trying to get in this country to invest. That's all domestically invested capital that's here now. We want to tap into that, one. Two, 80% of venture capital, nearly 80%, is invested in 3 states: Massachusetts, California, New York. The rest of the country splits that other 20%, and most states get barely any. 3, the rate of small business lending in this country is like at 20-year lows. There are less small and community banks. The big banks have gotten bigger. They're lending less to small companies. And 4, and this was a stat we found in a recent study we did, 5 U.S. cities account for the same net growth in new businesses as the rest of the country combined. Miami, New York, Dallas, LA, and Houston account for the same growth and new business creation, the same entrepreneurship growth as the rest of the country. Hugely uneven. Lots of entrepreneurs throughout the country. How do we connect those dots? So what the Investing Opportunity Act does is it really builds on this legacy, a bipartisan legacy, of how do you get the public and private sector to work together where the federal government or state governments can identify areas of need and federal capital can come in behind that. There are a couple really good examples outside of D.C., in addition to D.C., of places where you see big investors who are turning cities around. Dan Gilbert in Detroit, Kevin Plank in Baltimore, a lesser-known investor, Graham Weston in San Antonio, Tony Hsieh in Las Vegas. They're purposely building out the most troubled parts or some of the most troubled parts of those cities and making a big impact, but their investments are not enough. So what this does is different than those previous models, but trying to aim for a similar goal. Where those other models failed was they created zones, empowerment zones, enterprise zones, and the onus was on the companies in those zones to take advantage of that tax incentive. These companies were often pre-profit. They were often too small to be able to navigate what's a really complicated regulatory environment, and the credits never really worked. So we wanted to take a notion that gave that incentive to the investors but wasn't a credit, so that there was no taxpayer money on the hook. So it's set up basically as a deferral. It's like a small business rollover. If you've got capital gains and you want to reinvest it, you can defer your capital gains on those investments as long as you rolled over in a distressed community. And the bill calls those opportunity zones. They're designated as low-income communities that each governor in every state is allowed to pick a set of these opportunity zones, and investors can invest in just about any asset, but they have to show those assets are improving. So it's not a tax shelter, it's a place where you're actually growing real capital in those communities. It would move tens of billions of dollars over 10 years from investors right now who are just investing on the coast to distressed communities all over the country. It'd be the biggest privately financed economic development program in modern U.S. history, and it's got a huge amount of bipartisan support. It's something we actually think is achievable this year.
So considering the political climate that we're facing and some of the changes that changing in terms of federal policy, how likely do you see the passage of this bill? What's the over-under on it?
Until 6 months ago, I thought I was a terrific political prognosticator. I totally knew my stuff. Turns out I don't know anything, so take this all with a grain of salt. Yeah, I feel like it should be opposite day. I should say it's not going to pass. I think it's going to pass this year. Here's why. It's got a tremendous amount of bipartisan support. In the Senate, it's led by Senators Cory Booker from New Jersey and Tim Scott from South Carolina, two fantastic rising stars in both those parties. In the House, it's led by Pat Tiberi from Ohio and Ron Kind from Wisconsin, two Democrats from the Midwest. At the end of last year, it had about 70 sponsors, a majority of the Ways and Means Committee, which has responsibility for tax policy. It had everyone from the Republican Study Committee chair to the head of the New Democrats to Bobby Rush, who was a former Black Panther in the South Side of Chicago. It appeals across the ideological spectrum. If anything can pass, this can pass. I'm just not sure anything can pass this year. So, but if you're betting on anything, I would bet on this bill.
All right. Well, I want to make sure that we have the next panel come up soon, which is, again, another all-star panel. I think both of our guests today have, hosting guests, I guess is the question, have really created opportunities that we have not had in Washington, D.C. or even on a national level. And there's a lot of change that is coming. And I think it's a wonderful sense of the ingenuity and the creativity and the opportunities that are facing in front of us. So I want to have you all thank our panelists, and then we'll transition to the next guest.
I think Mayor Murphy and Mayor Bowser can have you come up. Hey, Tom. I don't know. They said Mayor Bowser. Mayor Bowser could come up. That'd be great. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. It's good to see you.
I understand we have a Pittsburgh connection. My daughter graduated.
So Thank you, Mayor Murphy and Mayor Bowser, for being here. You guys know who I am, so we'll just jump right in. It's very interesting to be with two mayors of my hometowns. I lived in Pittsburgh, as I mentioned, for 17 years, and I lived here for 3 when I taught at George Mason and developed the relationship I have with the Atlantic. And that was 10 years ago that I moved from the city to Toronto. And to see the transformation that has happened here in this market and beyond is truly remarkable. One thing I do want to note before introducing both mayors, Washington, D.C. is an epicenter of what I call the creative class. I just looked at my notes before coming up here. In the most current data that we have, nearly half of the workforce, 46.8% of the workforce, are members of the creative class. There's only one metropolitan area that's higher than that in the entire country. That's San Jose in the Silicon Valley. And it literally beats Washington, D.C. by a fraction of a percentage point with 46.9%. So I would say it's a tie. The other thing I want to note is that Washington, D.C. is doing reasonably well on the new urban crisis. It is having difficulties. It has levels of inequality and levels of economic segregation that the mayor is addressing. But it is not in the status of a New York or a Los Angeles or a San Francisco. I have the data here, it's in the book. But while those are 1, 2, and 3, Washington, D.C. among all metros is in the 40s, and it's in the 15s. That's still like to do much better, but it is not at the level, and it's at a position now to make those important decisions. And that's why I cannot tell you how delighted I was when you said you would come and have this conversation with us. Because as we've been talking about, Mayor, it is mayors now, especially in light of what's happened at the federal level, who are leading this country forward. Mayor Bowser has been mayor of this great city since 2015. And she has really, what we're going to talk about today, it was so nice for when I began to think about inclusive prosperity and talk with folks about it, to see you and your administration adopting this for this city it was just brought joy and hope in a time that I might have been despairing. So with her inclusive prosperity agenda is really driving not only, of course, to make this city more inclusive and more affordable and a bigger middle class, overcome its divides, but engaging in national conversation. Mayor Murphy was my mayor in Pittsburgh for almost every year that I lived there. He really was the mayor who got the city moving again and really spurred not just the investments in the economic, the pride of place. I think, Tom, you spurred a pride of place. And if you know Pittsburgh, a place that is about its neighborhoods, your focus on how those neighborhoods make a city great. And Tom was also close to the city and can talk about its revival. Well, anyway, let's start with Mayor Bowser. I've given the background on the city. I don't need to give more. Tell us a little bit about your tenure here, but most importantly, how did you get to the point where you thought you wanted to unveil this inclusive prosperity agenda, and what's that about?
Sure. Well, let me thank everybody. Can you hear me? Have you heard? Okay. For inviting me. I'm delighted to be here at Union Market. Okay. And I have a hometown Pittsburgh and a hometown DC.
That's wild. Yeah.
So it's good to be here with the mayor. I spent 4 years in Pittsburgh, and I have, of course, been born and raised in Washington, D.C. So when you ask me about my tenure in Washington, D.C., I kind of think it spans 44 years, because that's how old I am. And my family and commitment to the city spans that period of time. But I also had the great opportunity to serve in elected office since 2007, which I would put us kind of smack dab in the middle of Washington's Renaissance about that time. I've seen we've been joined, we have 3 planning directors here for Washington, D.C., who have had a great deal to do with how we've grown. Andy Altman, who served with Mayor Williams, Harriet Tregoning, who served with Mayor Fenty, and my planning director, who is also here, Eric Shaw. And I think we set out a bold agenda, starting with Mayor Williams, that in order for our city to rebound, because the incredible story of Washington has been long in the making, but we were a town that was broke. We were threatened to be taken over by the Congress. We had populations that were declining instead of fastly growing now. We had a well-earned reputation for bad business relationships and being bad for business. And we've spent a couple of decades turning all of those things around. I focus on two things as being the drivers of our renaissance, and that has been our dogged commitment to reforming our schools and our dogged commitment to public safety. With those two things, we've been able to attract people, families, and businesses, and those have led to soaring revenues that allow us to make the human services investments that we need. So why do I focus on prosperity and inclusive prosperity? And that's because while we are booming in many ways, we are becoming a town that's inaccessible for average people. And so my focus as a council member and now as mayor is how do you keep that prosperity and progress and growth going, but make it more attainable for more Washingtonians? Because I wouldn't be proud, none of us should be proud, if we build fantastic buildings and spaces, but we push people out who have been a part of that progress. And so that's been our focus.
You know, I love this city so much. It's funny, when I first came to visit, I was probably 18 or 19, no, probably in my early 20s in New Jersey. And I remember young people then buying places in DuPont Circle for like $35,000, if you can imagine. These were young people right out of college, you know, so-called urban pioneers wanting to live there. And you see how it's expensive. But I do want to say this, compared still, the chance is wide open here, but compared to New York or LA or San Francisco, this is still not quite in that league. So it's important that you act now. But the scale of the city, its neighborhoods, its walkability, it is one of the most, and of course today we see it in its full bloom. But I'm also think Pittsburgh is a spectacular city. You know this, Mayor Murphy, with its neighborhoods, its parks, its scale. And when I was at Carnegie Mellon, many of the young people were moving here. But now with housing prices, it's very interesting to see what happens in a dozen years. Now with housing prices as they are, Pittsburgh is now attracting young people back from Washington, D.C., from New York, people because of its affordability and all the greatness of that city. Because it's an example of a comeback city, and it's an example of one of these places that's bucking the trend towards geographic disparity. So maybe start at the beginning, Tom. Tell us about when you became mayor, or even before, the trauma that hit Pittsburgh, and importantly, because how did Pittsburgh really, I mentioned it in my earlier remarks, how did Pittsburgh, I don't want to even turn it around, how did it stop the cliff? You know, I think that's a very important part of the story, that it really stymied, it halted what could have been much deeper trauma. So start there and take us forward.
There's one word, Richard, and it's intentionality. That's the word. Okay, let me just give you, for those of you unfamiliar with Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh between 1970 and 1990, 500,000 people left the region. 500,000 people. We became the second oldest community in America. The Miami was the oldest community. It wasn't because old people were retiring to Pittsburgh. It's because all of our young people left. So that's why there are so many Steeler fans in Washington, D.C., okay? Because you brought that with you. And so we were managing decline. And we were doing okay, but we were managing decline. So the challenge was to reimagine Pittsburgh. That collapse happened because of the globalization of the steel industry. And it all literally in a 20-year period disappeared. And so we were faced with reimagining Pittsburgh, not only a land issue of thousands of acres of old industrial property, but a cultural issue of we had an economy based on big unions and big corporations, and we needed to move. And the first person I ever heard say the universities could be the economic drivers was president of CMU, Dick Cyrus. where you served under. And none of us understood what that meant, right? Is that it was, I mean, the universities hire people, they do research. What do you mean being an economic driver? And what Richard said is that we were watching lots of smart young people get trained at CMU, and then there was no reason to stay in Pittsburgh. We were not an attractive place. We weren't vibrant, and there were not a lot of jobs available. And so in a very intentional way, we thought about how to change that dynamic. And this is where the translation between policy and implementation often is misread, because that change, as bad as we were, was incredibly painful. One of the rules is that nobody wants to change. Whether you're in the worst economic circumstances or in the best economic circumstances, you don't want to change. And so it is a fundamental decision, I believe, of every leader, is that you make a fundamental choice. Do you want to be loved or do you want to be effective? Because if you're going to make changes, there's going to be conflict. And too many people in our business of politics don't want conflict. Oh, we'll set up a task force to study it. We'll get into this process. So I'm going to give you all some homework. You all need to read a book called Rules for Radicals, written by Saul Alinsky. And those of us with gray hair are going to laugh about it. Rush Limbaugh revived it periodically under Obama, but it is more important now than any book you will read, because it's about how to change things. And that is where we are. And let me just end by saying the challenge for the mayor and for every mayor around the country is that state legislatures, and in your case the federal government, are the black hole of American politics. Cities outside of Washington are governed by the states. The cities are creatures of the state. And then legislators are the most resistant to change and the most reactive. And in some cases, think of North Carolina or Pennsylvania or even Virginia, are actively antagonistic to their cities. And so the challenge of Saul Alinsky is to understand that if we're going to build the kind of inclusive cities that we need to change the rules, because the rules are set up for cities to simply survive now. They're not set up for cities to thrive. So Richard's thesis that cities need to be the center, not the tail of the conversation, is absolutely true. Cities are thriving in spite of the antagonism of many state legislators in the federal government.
And that's why, to build on what Tom said, this conversation is so important, because everything is working against you, Mayor Bowser. The state legislatures for other cities have long had an anti-urban or a rural bias in this country. I talk about that in the book. Our federal government, look at the map. We talked about that earlier. Look at how red the map is. In fact, currently, I think we're trying to do with our federal government, much of it, aside from the important work Steve and his colleagues are pushing against that, really have an anti-urban thrust. So we're acting against our economic drivers, our social and change drivers, but still, mayors have to persevere like you are. And I think it was at South by Southwest, I'm not sure, but it's very interesting that you mentioned it there. You know, South by Southwest, I went to the original ones. It is a celebration of digital technology, creative class, bro techno culture. And you went there with a message. You said, and that message is starting to get through. We need inclusive, think about that, inclusive innovation. We need an innovation system. And I just want to make an underline. When I think about innovation and creativity, that's why I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, I think our greatest innovators in the United States didn't come from the top of our society. My idol, my boyhood idol, Jimi Hendrix. We can go down the list. Louis Armstrong, Andy Warhol from Pittsburgh, working class, Polish kid. They came from the bottom up. So I want you to talk a little bit about this inclusive innovation, how you see it, both at a bigger agenda and also here in Washington, D.C.
Sure. So let me start by saying we're totally unique in the system, to the mayor's point. We operate like a city, a county, and a state. So while we don't have a state legislature, we do have the federal government. And while we push them away, day, when they're minding our business, we do call on them to mind the federal government's business in Washington. And they have some specific issues and responsibilities. Our parks, they have some roadways, they have the metro system, which carries a lot of their employees. So we do call on them to mind the federal government's business in our city. But being unique also has its benefits. Because the federal government largely stays out of the big issues that we face in Washington, which gives us the ability as a unique type of governing entity that really has 14 people making the decisions about a $13 billion budget. It gives us the ability to innovate and to act quickly, to try things quickly. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we fail, but we get to try things quickly. So when our planning director and DDOT director, and I see a former city administrator here, a former city administrator in the back, I'm going to give you an example. They had this wild idea to put, and Harriet will like this example, to put bike lanes down the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue. In some places, that probably would have been a 2-year process. It was about a 2-weekend process in the District of Columbia. So that, because we are unique and that we have 14 decision makers, we can get things done a lot more quickly. And our focus when we talk about South by and our niche in tech, it really is to send the message. Anytime we do these missions, South by is a mission for us. I'm going to send a group has been to China and to Cuba, and we're going to go to the Middle East. It is to tell people about Washington and who we are. And I frequently say, this is not your grandfather's Washington. Many people around the country honestly think that we're only a city with the White House and the Congress. They don't know about our 680,000 people, our great businesses, and the economy that drives this city. The truth is, we're growing more private sector jobs than any jurisdiction in the Metro Washington region as a share of our jobs. Most people wouldn't know that. And we know that when we focus on tech has grown quite organically in Washington. And what we've been in the last 2 years, Mayor, is more intentional about where our space should be in tech. And that's what we go to South by Southwest to talk about. The truth is that women technopreneurs do better in Washington, D.C. than anywhere else. The truth is, and it was a panelist earlier who said that the only 3 cities are getting venture capital, where we're trying to be more intentional about attracting that venture capital to Washington and doing it with underrepresented business. We are launching actually on April 20th in partnership with Howard University, an incubator in Washington, D.C., along one of our major corridors that will help us incubate space for underrepresented entrepreneurs in the tech space. And so that's what we are doing to make our economy, our businesses more diverse and to attract others.
You know, one of the things that happened to me, I think last time I was in the city, we were here at the market, and it was on the eve of the Women's March. And we went for a tour of the market, and in one of these big buildings, we saw a group of DC-based creatives, rainbow, Black, Latino, Asian, working there, and they had convened in this large shed building, women artists from all over the country, building the art for the march. And it uplifted me so powerfully to see. And these young people said, you know, DC is the heart and soul of a different kind of creative class. They told me a different kind of more inclusive movement, a movement that really shares a social and political vision. So I think and I do think, whether you're conservative or liberal, there is a new age of activism around localism, and I think DC could really be, you know, the way we talk national policy, I think it could be a heart and soul of that. Tom, coming back to this theme, it's funny, Mayor Peduto in Pittsburgh now has picked up on this theme of inclusive innovation. He's one of the other mayors talking about it, and when I lived in Pittsburgh, of course, and taught at Carnegie Mellon, there was this robotic tank that would roll around, you know, in the back of the parking lot. I'd go like, what is that tank doing with nobody driving it? But now Pittsburgh has become the center, really, of autonomous robot-controlled vehicles. In your view, I mean, because to me, it's just mind-boggling in this decade, you know, I've been away, how it went from what you said to now it's really a place that's become a second tier. It's not the Bay Area yet, but it is one of the places that's becoming a tech center. How, in your view, you've kept touch, you keep track, how in your view has that change occurred there?
I feel like I've gone to another planet, to be honest with you. But and because technology is driving, it is driving the economy there, and we are attracting thousands of young people who are attracted to the jobs and the cheap housing. And what is interesting, we began a development of a failed urban renewal area where 60% of the property in 1995 was tax delinquent. 60%. And you could have bought a house there for $1,000. And we started with an old Sears, an abandoned Sears building, convinced Home Depot to put a building there. Whole Foods opens. The year it opens, it's their highest percentage of food stamps in the country for a store. And now there's a big argument there about affordable housing. And so you don't want to apologize for that. That is great news that Google has 600 jobs there and Uber has 600 people working there, all because of the university, and there's hundreds of startup companies. And so that's where the intentionality comes in, is that I think mayors need the flexibility to lead, to sort of balance that success with what happens to people that live there, and whether they owned a home or they're renting, is how do you very intentionally begin to bring them in to the success story and not drive them out.
Follow to you, Tom. I saw that Whole Foods go in, and I saw the commitment that the Community Development Corporation said it's not just going to be food for the creative class. You're going to employ local people.
Right.
You're going to pay them a good wage. Right. And you're going to provide food that the neighborhood. It's not just going to be a Whole Food for the others. It's going to be a Whole Food for everyone. So the community. But the other thing that's really important, I think, is when I look at the new divide, universities are both a big part of the uptick, but unfortunately they're a big part of the problem. And it's not just the big urban centers that have this divide. Go to any college town, Boulder, Austin. I'm going to Columbus. I taught at Ohio State. You can see it there. Even in Gainesville. I'm not talking big ones. Tallahassee, where there's a knowledge-based institution like a university focused on research and technology and the talent. They're also getting a divide. Just off the top of your head, Mayor Murphy, is there any way that you think a university could help be more of a partner in this inclusive agenda?
Yeah, in most of the cities you mentioned, and in probably Washington, D.C., maybe not with the federal government, but in many of those cities you mentioned, the universities or hospitals are the largest employers. And it has been very mixed in terms of their sort of building that road from training. So let me go back to East Liberty. We worked with Whole Foods and Home Depot, and 80% of the employees they hired were walking to work. And initially Home Depot said, this is not where we're going to put a store, and we convinced them to bring a store there. And it has been, since it opened, the highest sales volume store in the Pittsburgh market. And so it disproved a lot of assumptions about poor neighborhoods, okay? But it was very intentional that we worked with Whole Foods, we worked with Home Depot to create that track. We recruited people, we being the city. We did initial training, Whole Foods, Home Depot get the choice. The universities have been resistant to doing that kind of really focused effort. And ironically, as you know, in Pittsburgh and in many other places, there's a large public housing community directly across the street from the University of Pittsburgh, right? And they might as well have been in two different cities.
Well, let me just say one thing about universities, because we are adjacent to one of the finest universities anywhere in the United States of America, at Gallaudet University, and they have been tremendous partners to the District of Columbia, and they will be a tremendous part of the transformation of this space. So
and I wanted you also talk, but Howard, the Gallaudet, this is where I wanted to go, so you have crafted a different way. This market has crafted a different way of working with university and colleges. You mentioned Howard. You are doing it. So both with Gallaudet and Howard, I wanted you to explain, how are you getting them part of this agenda? Where is this coming from?
Well, we want to take advantage. Not only are they fantastic employers, they're huge landowners, they're huge drivers of transportation patterns across the city. They are huge drivers of development projects because they're largely big landowners in the city. and we want to encourage them to get that land on the tax rolls. Because a lot of it isn't. And so we, as they have great neighborhood enhancing development projects that can help us drive our agenda, whether it's around tech and hiring DC residents for DC jobs or creating DC resident-owned businesses, they can also help us with another part of our inclusive prosperity agenda, and that's affordable housing. So when I look at opportunities, we always want to talk about how we can get more affordable housing.
What about the accelerator or the incubator at Howard? You threw that out there. It sounds fantastic. And tell us a little bit more about how you see that.
They're just kicking off, and I expect them to be able to attract people who want to start businesses and get other supportive services, and it will be a hub for us. What's the government's role really in that? And so sometimes we hear it's space, sometimes we hear it's convening people and making sure we're sending them the message that DC is a great place to do business, is helping to attract more capital for these young businesses, so we can get a part of that venture capital that's concentrated now in 3 areas. So that's what we think is going to happen there.
And shining a light on them like you're doing, and calling them out and saying how important they are is very. I have one last question because we're out of time for you, Mayor Bowser, and it really is: how do you think the private sector? This is a real estate town. People don't know this, but in terms of real estate finance, real estate development, this is a real cluster in Washington, big time cluster, national and a global cluster. How can the private real estate development community, places like this market, how can they help be part of an agenda, not just about building new buildings, but how can they partner with you to be help, as we're trying to do here, to bring inclusive prosperity to this neighborhood and community?
Well, I think that all of the development communities, and we are a hot market because of a lot of planning over a number of years to really focus on areas of our city where we need growth. We need that investment, and many of the areas have been underinvested in for a long time. And I'm proud that a lot of that development is following community-supported plans all along the way. So I think that the development community just needs to look at what we've laid out. Our goals for affordability in metro station areas is 30%, but how can you do more? There's one developer who had an interesting concept of, instead of just doing the 30% right on site a couple of miles away, there were more home ownership opportunities created in nearby communities. So use creativity. Look at what we can do around transportation, and look at what we can do around hiring. To be inclusive, we have to do a couple of things. We have to increase the incomes of local residents. We have to make affordability in housing, which is our chief challenge, a focus for everybody. And we have to be very, very aggressive in holding everybody accountable.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor Bowser. Thank you, Mayor Murphy.
Thank you.